I was rushing out of a meeting when my phone rang. I saw my dad's name on the screen and answered immediately, expecting his usual small talk. Instead, I heard muffled voices, like someone had butt-dialed me. I recognized Mother's voice first. He was laughing, and then I heard my brothers, Danny and Cole, chiming in. At first, I thought they were joking around, but then my dad's tone shifted. He said, "Jordan is such a failure. I can't believe she still calls herself part of this family." My heart twisted. I froze right there in the hallway. He went on about how I'd always been a burden, how I'd disappointed him since I was a kid. My brothers chuckled, and then Dad said, "I'll make you a bet. She won't accomplish anything real in her life." I had never heard him speak so cruelly about me. My fingers were clenched around the phone, my eyes burning with tears. I heard my mother in the background, trying to calm him. But she sounded tired. She said, "Don't be too hard on her," but never once challenged him. It felt like the final stab. I hung up silently. My chest felt tight. I realized in that moment, nothing I did would ever earn their respect. I sat in my office, staring at the blank wall. The phone call replayed in my head like a broken record. I wanted to confront them, but part of me felt powerless. My father's words cut deeper than any insult from a stranger. Growing up, I'd always tried hard to please him. I excelled in school, stayed out of trouble, and even helped around the house when no one else would. My brothers, Danny and Cole, were the golden boys, charming and fun, but rarely held accountable for anything. Dad praised them for every small achievement, while I got criticized for the tiniest mistake. Now that I was an adult with a growing business, I thought I'd finally proven my worth. But that call brought me back to the lonely little girl who tried so hard to be good enough. Anger mixed with a sense of betrayal, and all I wanted was to find some way to show him he was wrong. I clutched my phone, tempted to call back, to demand an explanation, but I knew it would only lead to more hurtful words. Instead, I took a deep breath and decided to keep silent, for now. I couldn't let them see my pain. The next day, I reviewed the financial records for one of my holding companies, JSC Holdings. It was a routine check, except now I was filled with an odd sense of bitterness. My hands trembled as I flipped through the documents. This company had been quietly paying off my parents' mortgage for the past 6 years. I remembered the day I found out they were on the brink of losing their home. I felt no hesitation. I stepped in and bought the property under JSC Holdings. I didn't want them to feel ashamed or indebted, so I kept my identity a secret. They believed an anonymous investor had helped them, and they were just paying a very low monthly amount. That was the biggest irony. They had no idea I was the reason they could still walk through those doors every night. And now, after hearing my father's words, I wondered, did I make a mistake by hiding it? My mother was meek but not entirely innocent, and my father was cruel. Neither seemed worthy of the help I'd given. Yet, here I was, steadily covering the payments. Their scorn felt like a slap across the face. I debated what to do next. Before this, I had always believed family was worth fighting for. Even if they were flawed, they were still my blood. But my father's bet, claiming I would never succeed, shook me to my core. I remembered times he teased me, saying I was just a girl with big dreams but no backbone. He would smirk whenever I mentioned my career plans. My brothers would snicker, making comments like, "Come on, Jordan, be realistic." Even so, I pushed forward. I was 21 when I started investing in small properties. My dad never once asked how I did it. He just called it a phase, predicted I'd fail, and returned to doting on my brothers. But I learned to tune them out, channeling that dismissal into my drive for success. Hearing that phone call was the ultimate proof that they saw me as a joke. They'd placed an actual bet on my downfall. They didn't just doubt me privately, they made it into a game, something to laugh about. My father, the man who should have been my biggest supporter, was now my harshest critic. It was time I started seeing them for who they really were. That evening, as I sat brooding over my laptop, my phone buzzed. It was my Uncle Ryan. He rarely called, so I knew it had to be important. "Jordan," he said in a quiet tone. "I need to tell you something." He spoke about how my father had been bad-mouthing me to anyone who'd listen, including extended family. Uncle Ryan confided that Dad planned to strong-arm me for more money. If I refused, Dad threatened to report me to the IRS, claiming I had shady deals going on. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. My father had no clue how my business worked, nor did he care about facts. He just wanted leverage. I felt my heart harden. Uncle Ryan said, "He's beyond ungrateful. You've been helping them for years, and now he wants to destroy you." I thanked my uncle, my voice trembling. Part of me wanted to say I already knew Dad hated me. But hearing it from another family member spelled out so clearly left me numb. I wondered if Dad's pride prevented him from admitting he needed me. Threatening me was easier than admitting he relied on my kindness. It was the final straw. I spent all night thinking about the betrayal. How could a father stoop so low? My anger grew with every passing minute. I pictured him pacing in their living room, complaining about my so-called failures while ignoring my financial rescue. For a moment, I thought about calling him directly, maybe even yelling at him to open his eyes. But Uncle Ryan's warning came back to me. If Dad was ready to contact the IRS or sabotage my reputation at work, I needed to be strategic. I decided to dig deeper into their mortgage records. Sure enough, they were behind on payments again. JSC Holdings had tolerated late fees and extended grace periods countless times, but they still had no idea I was behind the company. My father probably believed I was just some random businessman he could toy with. I felt an ache in my chest, remembering my mother's weak pleas in the background of that phone call. She wasn't innocent, but I knew she wasn't truly cruel. She was just silent, enabling him all these years. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. It was time to shift the balance. I wasn't going to remain their silent benefactor anymore. Over the next week, I made a decision. I would stop covering for them. If they missed the next mortgage payment, the property would officially revert to JSC Holdings. Legally, I already had ownership, but I had left enough space for them to feel in control. I summoned my team and laid out the instructions. The next time they default, we proceed with the standard protocol. No leniency. They might receive a polite notice to pay or face the consequences. Inside, I wrestled with guilt. Part of me still cared about them. But my father's hatred overshadowed any sense of duty. He wanted to see me fail, wanted to see me humiliated. Meanwhile, I had single-handedly saved him from bankruptcy for years. I reviewed the contract, every clause and condition. Everything was airtight. All I needed to do was wait. My father would slip up. He was always reckless about money, believing he was untouchable. When that happened, I'd step in, not as Jordan the daughter, but as Jordan the owner who'd had enough. I took a deep breath. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was about self-respect. If they couldn't appreciate my help, they certainly wouldn't get it for free anymore. On Thursday, my mother called me. Her voice sounded unusually warm, almost syrupy. "Jordan, sweetie, your father and I want you to come for dinner." I felt my stomach churn. They rarely invited me over except on birthdays or holidays, usually last minute after they'd invited everyone else first. Now it was a random Thursday night. I knew this had something to do with their finances. They must have noticed the looming late payment. Still, I agreed. I showed up at their house, the one I owned without them knowing. It looked the same, a cozy two-story with a faded porch swing. The inside smelled like roasting chicken. My father greeted me with a forced grin, my brothers nowhere in sight. He asked about my work in that condescending tone, as if waiting for me to admit failure. My mother played the gracious hostess, urging me to eat. The tension was so thick it felt like a physical presence. Then my father cleared his throat, voice dripping with false affection. "So, how's business, dear? Everything going well?" He was fishing for an opening to ask for money. I could almost see the wheels turning in his mind. I forced a smile, determined to play along. During dinner, I tried not to show how uneasy I felt. My parents peppered me with questions about my career, my successes, and my income. My father kept nodding like he was proud of me, something I'd rarely seen. Yet, his eyes sparkled with calculation, not pride. "Your brothers are doing well," he boasted. "Cole just bought a new SUV, and Danny's working on a side project that could be huge." He waited for me to congratulate them. Instead, I asked how they were managing the costs. He stumbled over his words, and I realized they were counting on a handout to keep up appearances. Then my mother chimed in gently. "Jordan, we wanted to talk about a loan. Nothing big, just a bit to tide us over." The awkwardness was suffocating. They pretended it was a small favor, but I knew their financial struggles ran deeper. I nodded, feigning politeness. "Let me think about it," I said. In truth, I already knew the next mortgage payment was overdue. I wanted to see how far they'd push me. Their obliviousness stung. They had no clue that I, their daughter, was the last person they should manipulate right now. I drove home feeling a storm of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me wanted to scream at them, lay out every document proving my ownership of their home. Another part of me felt exhausted, wishing I could wash my hands of them altogether. Yet, I remembered Uncle Ryan's warning. My father wouldn't hesitate to use underhanded tactics to get what he wanted. If I confronted him head-on, he might lash out publicly or try to tarnish my reputation, especially at my job. I needed to remain calm and methodical. Back at my apartment, I made a quick dinner and sat at my kitchen table, thinking about the next step. My father had basically spelled out his plan. Sweet-talk me, get more money, continue insulting me behind my back. But now, time was running out on the mortgage. I knew from my records that in a week or two, they'd be declared officially in default. I had drawn a line in the sand. No more extended grace periods, no special favors. The final blow was coming, and I wondered how they'd react when they realized I was the one pulling the strings. For once, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. The following morning, I called my lawyer, Ethan. We'd worked together since I launched JSC Holdings, and he was well aware of the unusual arrangement with my parents. He always encouraged me to be transparent, but I'd chosen secrecy to protect their pride. I told Ethan I was done protecting them. "Proceed normally," I said. "When they miss the next payment, move forward with the legal steps." He paused. "Are you sure? This could cause a family rift you can't repair." "I'm positive," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I explained the betrayal, the phone call, my father's threats. Ethan listened quietly, then assured me everything was by the book. The property deed was in JSC Holdings' name. Once they defaulted, I had every legal right to either evict them or renegotiate the lease. "It's harsh," Ethan said gently, "but you've been harshly treated. You've done more than enough for them." After we hung up, I stared at the city skyline through my window. I felt a twinge of sorrow. Regardless of our strained relationship, these were my parents. It didn't feel good to push them out, but I had no other choice if I wanted to protect myself. A week later, I received a frantic phone call from my mother. She was panicking because they'd just been informed their mortgage was in default. They had 30 days to settle or risk foreclosure. Their once confident tone was replaced by fear and confusion. "Jordan, you have to help us," she cried. "This can't happen. Your father will lose his mind if we lose the house." I feigned ignorance. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I don't have that kind of money to spare right now," she pleaded. "What about your company? Surely you can do something." I took a breath and replied, "Mom, I have to check our finances, but I can't promise anything." In truth, I felt oddly numb. I wondered if I should just reveal everything. Yet, a part of me wanted them to realize the gravity of the situation on their own. Exactly what it meant to disrespect and manipulate someone who had been their silent ally. I ended the call with a vague promise to look into it. My father didn't bother to speak to me directly, which was telling. He probably still believed he could bully some unknown landlord or investor into submission. He was in for a rude awakening. Not long after, Danny and Cole showed up at my doorstep unannounced. I opened the door to see my brothers standing there, arms folded, wearing tense expressions. Cole was the first to speak. "Jordan, we need your help. Dad says we're in big trouble." Danny chimed in. "He mentioned you've got connections. Maybe you can negotiate with the guy who owns the house." I raised an eyebrow, tempted to burst out laughing at the irony. I asked, "Why should I help? Didn't you both tell Dad I'd never succeed?" They exchanged guilty looks, but Danny tried to keep a smug edge. "Look, we may have said some stuff, but this is serious. We could lose everything." Cole added, "Yeah, and Dad said you're the only one who might fix this. You're the business genius, right?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, but I sensed desperation beneath it. I took a breath, controlling my anger. They had no idea that the business genius they mocked was the person who single-handedly saved them from foreclosure in the past. Instead of revealing the truth, I said, "I'll see what I can do, but I make no promises." They left without a thank you. Typical. That night, Uncle Ryan called again. "Jordan, I heard from your brothers. They're running around, trying to figure out how to stop the foreclosure. They're clueless." I filled him in on my silent plan. He was stunned but also sympathetic. "They've taken advantage of you for too long, kiddo. This might be the wake-up call they deserve." I sank into my chair, thinking about the heartbreak this was bound to cause my mother. But I knew I couldn't shoulder the blame anymore. My father had crossed every line, from insulting me to threatening my livelihood. If he wanted war, I wasn't going to lie down and lose. It amazed me how quickly their facade of confidence crumbled once the threat of losing the house became real. They were used to me rescuing them, but they never bothered to ask how or why I was able to do it. They'd gotten comfortable seeing me as a doormat. Now the mask was slipping. Their desperation was clear, and I was no longer hiding my resolve. The power dynamic was shifting, and I felt stronger than I ever had before. This was the beginning of the end for their manipulations. A few days later, the official foreclosure notice arrived at my parents' house. My father, in a complete panic, called me for the first time in weeks. His voice was shaky, but he tried to mask it with anger. "Jordan, you need to come over. Now." Curiosity won out. I drove to their house, arriving to see my parents and brothers huddled around a stack of papers. When I walked in, my father thrust them at me. "Read this. The house is apparently owned by JSC Holdings, and they're pulling the plug if we don't pay up." I took the papers, pretending to peruse them carefully. Then I placed them back on the table. "I see." My mother's eyes darted between us. "Can't you talk to them, Jordan? You do business with companies like that. Maybe you know someone there." I inhaled slowly and looked my father dead in the eyes. "I'm sorry, but I doubt they'll budge. Companies don't usually show mercy in these situations." He stared at me, a mixture of fury and helplessness. I could tell he hated that he had to ask for my help, especially after all the horrible things he'd said about me. I didn't flinch. They had no idea the storm was just beginning. That evening, my father insisted we all sit down for a family discussion. The tension was palpable as we gathered in the living room. He started by laying out the timeline. "We have 30 days. If we don't pay, we're out." He glanced at me expectantly, wanting me to fix it. But for once, I wasn't jumping to help. My brothers tried to be supportive, but they were mostly telling Dad to calm down. My mother sat quietly, staring at the tablecloth. Finally, Dad spoke directly to me. "You have money. Don't act like you don't. Help us out, and we'll make it worth your while." That phrase, "make it worth your while," echoed in my mind, as if I was some outsider they had to bribe. I asked, "And how exactly will you do that?" He hesitated, caught off guard. My father was never good at negotiating without intimidation. We'll pay you back with interest," he said weakly. My brothers nodded in agreement, but they looked unconvinced themselves. I scanned their faces, seeing entitlement and fear. No one apologized or acknowledged the cruelty they'd shown me. I decided then that revealing the truth at this moment wouldn't satisfy me. Not yet. I wanted them to see the consequences first. 2 days later, an official letter from JSC Holdings arrived at my parents' home. It was a formal eviction notice stating that if the outstanding balance wasn't paid within the 30-day deadline, they would be required to vacate. I drove to their house, carrying another copy of the same document. I handed it to my father as he answered the door. He snatched it from my hands, face reddening. "What are you doing with this?" he roared. I stood tall. "I wanted to be sure you understood the terms." Danny and Cole emerged from the living room. My mother hovered behind them. Silence hung in the air. Then I said calmly, "JSC Holdings, that's my company. I own this house." Their reactions were priceless. My father's eyes bulged. My brother's jaws dropped. My mother took a step back, like she'd seen a ghost. "I've been paying your mortgage for 6 years, I continued, my voice betraying none of my inner turmoil. "You've been insulting me, betting on my failure, while living under a roof I provided." The truth crashed over them like a tidal wave. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for them to grasp the weight of their actions. For a moment, no one said a word. My father was the first to react, his face twisted with rage. "You can't do this. This is our home." He pointed a trembling finger at me, as if accusing me of a crime. "You tricked us. Who does that to their own parents?" My mother started sobbing quietly, unsure of what to say. Danny and Cole looked stunned, like they'd walked into a nightmare. I stood firm, crossing my arms. I stepped in to save you from foreclosure years ago. I did it secretly because I didn't want you to feel embarrassed. And how did you repay me? By betting on my downfall, calling me a failure behind my back. Cole tried to plead. Jordan, we didn't know. I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. You did know in your hearts how you treat me. You just didn't care. Now it's my turn to stop caring. My father slammed his fist on the table. I refuse to be your tenant, he yelled, spittle flying. I won't pay you a dime. I met his glare with icy resolve. Then you'll be evicted. That's the legal process. For the next few days, my phone didn't stop ringing. My mother left tearful voicemails pleading for forgiveness and understanding. Danny and Cole texted me constantly, offering apologies and making excuses. Dad, however, tried a different tactic, calling my workplace. He demanded to speak to HR, claiming I was a fraud who embezzled money. Thankfully, I had already preemptively warned my boss about potential family drama. They knew my track record and brushed off his accusations. The final straw came when Dad showed up at my office building, causing a scene in the lobby. Security escorted him out, and I got an apologetic message from the front desk. I felt mortified, but also fueled by a new kind of anger. There was no line he wouldn't cross. I called Ethan, my lawyer, detailing everything. He assured me we were fully protected. If my father tried to sue or slander me publicly, we had evidence to fight back. In fact, we could charge him with harassment if it continued. Tears burned my eyes after I hung up. It was a painful realization, but any bond I had with my father was beyond repair. The man was willing to ruin my life rather than face his own failures. The 30-day deadline came faster than anyone wanted. My family hadn't paid a cent. Whether it was stubborn pride or lack of funds, I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't care anymore. Ethan finalized the paperwork. By law, my parents and brothers had to vacate the property. I wanted to give them more time, but that nightmarish phone call from Dad to my workplace was a painful reminder of how malicious he could be. I had already given them extra chances, year after year. Enough was enough. I didn't attend the official eviction. My lawyers handled it, along with local authorities. I heard my father tried to argue, but the papers were clear. The deed wasn't in their name, and they owed months of unpaid fees. That evening, I sat in my apartment, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I knew they'd be devastated, but they had brought it upon themselves. The final image of them packing up their belongings in their house was burned into my mind, even though I wasn't physically there. They were no longer my responsibility. I was free from the cycle of financial rescue and emotional abuse that had overshadowed my life. In the days following the eviction, I received no calls or messages from my father. A part of me wondered if he'd finally realized the depth of his betrayal. My mother sent a few timid texts, mostly along the lines of, "I'm sorry things turned out this way." But there was no real apology for the years of insults or the recent attempts to sabotage my career. Meanwhile, I arranged to sell the house through JSC Holdings. I found a buyer quickly, an investor who wanted to flip the property. The deal was finalized within a month. I walked away with a tidy profit, more than enough to justify the years of mortgage payments and stress. Some nights, I thought about them, where they might be staying if they hated me even more now. But I fought off the guilt. Every step I'd taken was a response to their cruelty, not an unprovoked attack. With the proceeds from the sale, I decided to expand my real estate ventures. Buying and flipping properties became my new passion. In a way, it felt like taking something painful from my past and turning it into a path toward a brighter future. With the success of my first flip, I gained confidence to launch a real estate fund aimed at helping women who were escaping toxic family situations or abusive relationships. It started small, a handful of properties under JSC Holdings that I renovated and offered at reduced rent to women in need. The idea blossomed into a full-blown mission. I gathered a team of experts, social workers, financial advisors, and legal consultants to support these women in rebuilding their lives. I named it the Bright Future Fund, and the response was overwhelming. Donations, partnerships, and media interest started rolling in. For the first time, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal success. I was using my abilities and experiences to make a meaningful impact on others' lives. People learned bits of my story, how I had overcome a toxic family environment, and found hope in my journey. I still had moments of lingering sadness. Family is supposed to be a source of love and support, and mine had become a well of poison. Yet, turning that pain into something constructive lifted my spirits. I was proving, to myself above all, that I could rise above their negativity and create real change. Months later, as I was preparing for a networking event, I opened my email to find a message from my mother. The subject line read, "Can we talk?" I felt my heart rate spike. I hovered over the message, unsure whether to click. Eventually, curiosity won out. In it, she wrote about how they were living in a cramped apartment, struggling to make ends meet. Dad's pride was shattered, and my brothers were barely contributing. She apologized for not defending me more, claiming she had always cared for me, but felt powerless against Dad's temper. She ended with a plea. "Please, come see us. Let's fix this before it's too late." I stared at the words, remembering all the times she'd chosen silence when Dad belittled me, all the times she'd let him insult me without stepping in. My childhood self would have jumped at this chance, desperate for a mother's love. But the adult in me recalled the manipulations and the endless cycle of emotional abuse. Without hesitation, I hit delete. I felt a pang of regret, but also a surge of relief. Some bridges deserved to be burned for my own peace of mind. After deleting my mother's email, I expected a wave of guilt, maybe even second-guessing. Instead, I felt a quiet calm settle over me. It was as if a door had finally closed on a chapter of my life riddled with hurt and betrayal. I threw myself deeper into my work with the Bright Future Fund. Every day, I met women who reminded me of the little girl I once was, scared, seeking acceptance from people who'd never give it. By sharing my story in a gentle, supportive way, I found a sense of release. I was no longer burdened by shame or desperation for my family's approval. Sometimes I'd hear rumors that my father blamed me for abandoning them, or that my brothers cursed my name whenever they faced financial hurdles. But none of that mattered anymore. I was done letting their negativity control my happiness. I learned something crucial. Family isn't just about blood. It's about respect, empathy, and genuine connection. And if your blood relatives can't give you that, you have every right to find it elsewhere, in people who value you for who you are. I felt lighter, as though a massive weight had been lifted from my soul. Life kept moving forward, and so did I. My real estate ventures thrived. The Bright Future Fund expanded, helping more women than I'd ever dreamed possible. I formed relationships that felt genuine and healthy, filled with mutual respect. Reflecting on my journey, I realized how much I'd grown. The little girl inside me, once desperate for her father's approval, had evolved into a self-assured woman capable of forging her own path. The bet he made with my brothers, that I'd never succeed, turned into the spark that fueled my greatest triumphs. Sometimes I wonder if Dad, Mom, Danny, and Cole ever look at my success and realize what they lost. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. All I know is that I have nothing left to prove to them. My worth is no longer in their hands. Letting go wasn't easy. Evicting them was a painful act of self-preservation. But in the end, it freed me to discover my true potential. My father's cruelty became the unintentional catalyst for my growth. I chose peace over chaos, a future over a past that held me back. And for that, strangely enough, I'm grateful. I finally get to live life on my own terms.